Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about point 4 on my list for why the LDS or Mormon church isn't necessarily good. And this point has to do with the church's view of sex and sexuality. Now, this actually isn't the first time that I've tried to make this video. I have tried to do this before and it hasn't worked out too well. And I think that's because this is kind of a big topic because there are multiple ways in which the church's view of sexuality is potentially harmful. But hopefully this time I'm able to finish this video and get it uploaded so you all can see it. So before I get into sex specifically, what I want to talk about is something that one of the commenters on one of my other videos brought up, which is that this list of points, this list of videos that I've been making, really only applies in some sense if the church isn't true. Because if the church is true, then that means that God really wants people to be living within the church in order to receive the ordinances necessary for salvation and exaltation. So, therefore, any amount of what seems like crap that the church is putting us through must be worth it. What this video is really aimed to discuss is the idea that the church is good whether it's true or not, and that you can see its goodness in the lives of people throughout the church. And it's a good way to live your life, regardless of whether it's true or not, because I've heard that before. And I think in some ways it is good. It has been good for some people. But when I talk about how the church isn't necessarily good, what I mean is that for some people, it is damaging if it isn't true. And I think one of the ways you see this most clearly is in their views about sex. Because if their views about sex are founded in reality, well, then obviously they would be good. But I think just based on what I've seen in my own life, the church's views on sex really aren't founded in reality. And that's evidence that the church isn't true. And also evidence that if the church isn't true, then it certainly isn't good for everyone. So now to get into what the church's view on sex is, the best way to sum it up is that anything sexual outside of a marriage between a man and a woman is wrong. So that would mean stimulating yourself is wrong. That would mean having a homosexual relationship is wrong. That would mean viewing pornography or erotic content is wrong. And all of that gets lumped under the same umbrella. But I think that the idea that all these things are wrong can be a problem for people for different reasons, because there are a couple of different things going on here. One is that different people have different levels of sexual arousal in different situations. So things that turn on one person might not turn on another person, even if they have the same sexual orientation, technically, meaning that, they're attracted generally to the same kinds of people, but it might take more stimulation or just a narrower group of people within that group of people to turn a person on. There are people who call themselves demisexual or demisexual because they are not as attracted to people sexually until they actually know the person. And that's just one example of people who are not going to be turned on in certain situations that other people are turned on by. And I think what tends to happen within the church is that the people who are not turned on as often or as much go through the church thinking that everyone else has the same experience that they do, that they can just deal with it easily, even though there are people who are turned on a lot more often than they are. And that leads to problems because essentially the group that has less of a problem with some of the church's views on sex is assuming that there's something wrong with the other group when really they're all within a normal range, or at least most of them are, and it's not bad to be turned on more often than somebody else. But when you're not married yet, it's seen as wrong. Depending on how you view it, you can see your thoughts as bad and as temptations when they're just a part of how your brain works. And it's something connected to reproduction, which is a part of how our species works. You need reproduction in order to exist as a species. So it's not wrong. It just is. So that's the first thing that I think people can generalize based on their own experience in that way. And then you add on top of that the idea that homosexuality is wrong. And suddenly you have people, whether they are homosexual or heterosexual, if they're not as turned on as other people, making generalizations and saying, well, I can deal with the standards of the church. Why can't this person? When really, I think, there are people who are homosexual that if sex is less of a big deal to them, just because of how they are, whether, they're on some spectrum of asexuality or something, and it's not as big of a deal to them to be celibate, who are able to remain celibate for their whole lives. But that is not everybody's experience. And I think it is a little bit frustrating when the church puts forth people who are following the standards, when part of the reason they're following the standards for a lot of them is likely because they actually experience their sexuality different than other people who aren't. And so that's how I view the situation of a lot of people that the church puts forward as people who are following their standards, even though they may not fit the mold exactly. Because in other ways, they do fit the mold in ways that certain people don't. So there's that. And then there's the whole fact that there are two ways of looking at the situation. There's the perspective that the church is true, and there's the perspective that the church is not true. And I'm going to go into both of those. If the church is true, then everything that the church says is immoral is immoral. So that means that sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman is always immoral. Okay. So that means that it is never right to have gay or lesbian sex ever. And at that point, we've got to ask ourselves, well, why is that? Because Mormons, as far as I know, at least when I was Mormon, I did not believe that God made arbitrary rules. I believe that the reason God made the rules he did was because his hand was forced in certain ways, that God would not make an arbitrary rule that was harder for some people to follow than others. For example, the rule against anger had, reasons for it. Anger is an unpleasant emotion that can lead to people being violent. There are reasons why anger is seen as bad in the church. Now, I don't really agree with what I used to think when it comes to anger, because I think that anger is just a part of life at this point. But I think that at least you can see why anger would be seen in a damaging light, and why people would want to avoid it. Um, so you have to ask yourself, well, in what way then is homosexuality hurting people? And it's hard to figure out why that would be. What I came to the conclusion of was that there was some reason, um, that it was causing problems that I just couldn't see when I was trying to trust the leaders of the church on this. But the truth is, you really have to take it on faith, if you're a member, that this is causing problems, or admit that you disagree with the leaders on this. And either way, that's kind of hard to do, especially if you are gay or lesbian or bisexual. So that is the believer's perspective. And then the non believer's perspective is that there isn't any evidence that this is causing problems. Therefore, it's not causing problems as far as we know. Therefore, the church is shaming people for doing something that isn't actually causing anyone problems, and therefore isn't wrong. And from that perspective, this whole thing is actually really damaging, because it's leading people to assume that they're doing something wrong when they're not. And that leads to a lot of unnecessary guilt. And that's really sad. And I was just getting into homosexuality, but there's also people who are more sexual than other people, even if they're straight, who feel like there's something wrong with them because they have sexual urges that are stronger than certain other people. And then they have um, situations where they regularly self-stimulate and feel incredibly guilty for it, and are denied privileges within the church because of that, even though they are straight, and even though everything they are doing is completely normal. And that also is frustrating and concerning from a non-believer's perspective, because again, it's not like anything that they are doing is hurting anyone necessarily. In a lot of these cases, if these people are self-stimulating, then they are they're not they're not spreading diseases, they're not going to get anybody pregnant, and they're not exposing anybody else to experiences and feelings that they're not ready for. And those are the three reasons that I can think of to avoid having sex in certain situations that are important. But in that case, none of those things apply. And so it is really frustrating to know that there are people who do benefit from that don't have a sexual outlet that is approved by the church unless they're married. Whether they are gay or not, they have these urges and these things that affect their lives that they aren't even allowed to deal with on their own without getting in trouble for it if they're honest. And a lot of people aren't honest about this. And then that means the people who are honest about this are getting punished. So there are two groups of people that I really worry about here. And there's an intersection between those groups, but it's the people who are gay, and it's the people who are sexual enough to the point where they where not stimulating themselves in some way becomes a distraction from their life, because it's very hard not to do that for them. And so those are the groups that I really worry about. And those are the groups that I think that this thing really damages. This idea that all sexual stuff outside of a marriage between a man and a woman is wrong. And like I said, if the church is true, then this is kind of a moot point, because God will make it so that people are better off if they follow his commands, regardless of whether they would have been better off if God hadn't done anything. God will make it so that people will be better off if they follow his commands, if the church is true, even if the reason was arbitrary. But if the church isn't true, if this thing isn't true, then this is causing a lot of unnecessary problems for people. And that's why I think that this is kind of the big red flag about the church for a lot of people, because just the indications of people's lives who do not fit the mold that the church wants them to fit here, that they are happier when they don't follow the church in regards to this, shows that the church isn't necessarily good. It really isn't. Sometimes for some people it is, but for some people it's not. And I think that the sooner we can recognize that, the sooner we can be sympathetic to people who either choose to leave the church because of this, or who struggle within the church because of this. And those are my thoughts on that. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I want to say thank you to all the people who have subscribed recently. One of my videos happened to get a lot of views compared to my other videos recently, and as a result, I've got a lot of new subscribers compared to what I had before. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who subscribed. And if you haven't subscribed yet, if you're just watching this for the first time, please consider subscribing. Also, please like this video and comment below on your thoughts on sexuality. Do you think I hit the mark here or not? Let me know, and I will see you all next time. Bye.